Well, hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Easton, president of the Claire Booth Luce Policy Institute, and I want to welcome you all to this month's Conservative Women's Network. It's a pleasure. We do this every month with the Heritage Foundation. Bridget Wagner, our partner in crime here, and we got somebody really good for you today. Star Parker. She's one of the conservative movement's most exceptional and energetic leaders. Before Star's involvement in the conservative movement, she had 7 years of first-hand experience in the grip of welfare dependency. You know, the world of welfare is not something Star's just read about. And she's going to talk with us today about how the liberals in Washington are quietly gutting the work requirement in our welfare reform law. Star founded CURE, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, in 1995, to bring new energy to policy discussions on how to transition America's poor from government dependency. She's got a bachelor's degree in marketing and international business from Woodbury University. And one of the things Star does is she consults with legislators on market-based strategies to fight poverty. She also lectures at major churches, conferences, and colleges around the country, sometimes for the Claire Booth Luce Policy Institute's lecture program, including last year she spoke for us at Smith College, and this fall she's going to do a talk, a joint talk, at Harding University in Arkansas with us. She writes insightful columns on key issues, and her columns are nationally syndicated by Scripps News Service, which reaches 7 million readers weekly. And often you find Star's articles are posted on the front page of our website, cblpi.org, because they're so good. She's written some tremendously powerful books, including, in 2010, she wrote Uncle Sam's Plantation, How Big Government Enslaves America's Poor and What We Can Do About It. In 2009, she wrote White Ghetto, How Middle-Class America Reflects Inner City Decay. And my favorite book, in 1998, Star wrote Pimps, Whores, and Welfare Cheats, From Welfare Cheat to Conservative Messenger. What a wonderful book that was. Star is a mom and a grandmother. She loves spending time with her 2 grandchildren back in California. That's why she's always flying out of here in such a hurry. She also loves riding her bike around D.C. That's how she stays so trim and so fit. And we have a picture of Star in our 2012 Great American Conservative Women calendar. There she is on her bike in front of the Lincoln Memorial. I give you credit. It's tough riding in D.C. Star's a good friend, and I'm sure glad she's on our side. Please join me in welcoming Star Parker.
We are good friends. And it is, actually, I can't ride around as much as I used to, because one of the papers that distributes my column, publishes my column, is here in town. It's the Washington Examiner. And so more and more people are starting to recognize me because they're a free paper. So they pay people to pass it out at the Metro stops. And so a lot of people are getting it who are not in the norm of traditionally conservative circles. And so therefore they'll see me and say, what are you doing on my corner? And in fact, one time I went into the post office and the woman behind the counter who was to sell me stamps said, how dare you come to my window? No, you didn't. I said, excuse me? She said, after what you wrote about my president? I took a deep breath and I spent the next 20 minutes telling her what her president has been doing to me. And with my health care, with my taxes, with my traditional norms and values, and the line kept getting longer and longer and longer behind me. And as I left the post office, I thought, oh my gosh, I can never come here again. I'm looking over my shoulder. And so ever since they put the bike lanes in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue, I don't get to ride as much. And they sent a survey to us and said, oh, how do you like where we put our new bike lanes? I'm thinking, why would you put bike lanes in the middle of the road so that now you have to deal with oncoming traffic and the one behind you? But I do enjoy that part of my life, and I enjoy my grandchildren, and I really enjoy these opportunities to talk about my ideas. And I want to thank Claire Booth Luce and Bridget Wagner because, you know, I met Bridget during the time that we were looking to reform welfare. You know, I knew firsthand the damage that had been done by this monstrous government program that we had developed in our society. You know, you think about the 60s when they were selling these ideas that we had to do something to solve black poverty specifically because of Jim Crow, because of the legacy of slavery, and we started engineering this welfare state, starting to pay people for having children outside of marriage. You know, we thought that rules of welfare, don't work, don't save, don't get married, were good for people, and yet they were totally destructive. It's one of the reasons that I lived 7 years in and out, 3.5 years, just watching my life spiral into a little dark hole. And it wasn't until after a Christian conversion that I totally changed my life. I went back to school, got a degree, and started a business. And during the 1992 riots, when that business was destroyed, that's when I began to focus on public policy. And I thought perhaps we could come up with something better than what we're seeing in the policies that are already telling people that they don't have to think about their life, that they don't have to mainstream their life. And the more I developed out my ideas on what it really takes to break out of poverty, the more intrigued I was in public policy, and got out here quite often and was able to then meet with Heritage and started working with them to get welfare reform as a reality. In 1996, when it became a reality, it was like, okay, now what do we do? You know, we know what not to do. When you think about redistributing $400 billion so that people will, from womb to tomb, be dependent on government, when we think about the damage that was done in our hard-hit communities and how we were going to restore them, I thought maybe we should look at how we could come up with some market-based solutions to fight poverty. Maybe in reflecting on that 32% that didn't have a high school diploma and didn't have work experience and had multiple children, those that we had trapped in the 4,000 housing projects that we had placed around the country as a result of this Great Society social engineering project. Maybe we should find other ways that people can recover their lives. Instead of forcing them into a one-size-fits-all scenario, perhaps we should push ideas of vouchers in many, many areas. I want vouchers in a lot of different places. And so after moving to that point where welfare reform became a reality, I started my organization CURE, which is what I run today here in Washington. It's a Center for Urban Renewal and Education. We're a policy think tank. We only focus on issues of poverty, making sure that we follow the steps. You know, I did a column a few years back that said that there are no absolute steps, if you will, to get out of poverty. If there were, I'd bottle them. I'd make it in a book and a presentation, and then I'd be very, very, very wealthy. And then I'll be on the little short list of those that they come after, and I'll be in the 1%, and the occupiers would camp out after me. But there are certain steps that you can do to decrease poverty and ensure that your life could live healthy, especially in this great country of ours. But I did this column saying there are absolutely steps to stay poor. If you want to be poor, there are ways that you can stay poor in this country. You know, I was recently on an airplane coming up from North Carolina going into Ohio, and I met some refugees, and only one on the plane spoke English. And by the time I got on the plane, everybody was grumbling about how there was no organization on the plane because people were in everybody else's seats, and it wasn't a Southwest. Everyone was assigned to a seat. And they were all in everybody's seat, and so I ended up not in the first row, but in the very last row with the only person that could speak English in the group. And so I found out a little bit about what was occurring and why it was that we had all of these folks on the plane who were outside of where they were supposed to be in terms of the assigned seat. And he told me that they were coming in from Iran and that they were refugees, that the communist country that they were a part of before totally collapsed, and now they were in another country, and they were moving about 50,000 of them into America. And so as we got to chatting, he was telling me about communism, and one of the things that they lied about America is they told him that we didn't have any trees. And the reason that he was telling me this is because you're flying out of North Carolina into Ohio, all you see is trees. And he's like fascinated because they had brought him into New York the night before, so it was dark. And they taught them that capitalism is so cruel that they just have wiped away all of the trees in America. And the reason I'm telling you this is because when I got to telling him about how wonderful and fruitful America is, I even told him my story about how it embodies American exceptionalism, that after breaking my life, believing the lie of the left, getting involved in criminal activity, drug activity, sexual activity, I mean, my goodness, it had just totally collapsed, that anyone from any background, any ethnicity can have a born again and then actually recover their lives and be prosperous in this wonderful, great country of ours. I said, you can just be anything you want to. And he was sharing with me how he was a teacher in his country, and do you think that he'll ever be able to be a teacher here? And I said, oh, absolutely. He said, well, a lot of people don't speak much English. I said, half the people in this country don't speak much English. You'll do just fine, especially if you go to California. You can take our driver's license in 40 different languages. And so I said, you could be a teacher. I said, you could be a doctor. You can be anything you want to. I said, you could be a bum. And he said, what's a bum? And so I'm telling you that to say that there is no formula to get rich, but there is certainly a formula to stay poor. I mean, all you have to do is what I did, just don't mainstream your life. Just blame your problems on somebody else. My problems are somebody else's fault. Believe the lie that the poor are poor because the wealthy are wealthy. Believe that America is so inherently racist that you don't have to mainstream. If you make bad choices for your life, if you don't finish school, if you won't work, if you don't ever save or invest any money, you could live poor. You will live poor in this country. But in getting to the opportunities that we opened up for women and their children after welfare reform so that they could at least get on the path toward health, toward wholeness, toward peace, whether they ever realized a $1 million bank account or not, was not our goal in welfare reform. It was to restore dignity that was stolen from them during the cruel hand of the government, who would send them out a paper once a month that made sure that they didn't work, that they didn't save, that they didn't marry, that no one turned 18 and no one died in that household. And if they said no to all of those questions, we would just kind of keep them enslaved to this poverty plantation from womb to tomb with only this much life that they didn't have no investment in at all. So one of the best things that we did was help them invest in their own lives, helping them get on that first step out of poverty, which is self-government. Helping them to understand that, if you really want to be successful, if you want to get anywhere with your life, that you have a part in this, that you have to be responsible with the choices that you make, that actually you have an obligation to your neighbor to be responsible with your choices, to be self-sufficient. And once we can get people to agree with those principles, they can begin the process and the journey toward health and wholeness, and then begin to mainstream their lives and perhaps even have economic prosperity, because it is available for anyone that does want it. It takes a lot of work, but it is absolutely available in this great country of ours. And what was interesting about getting them to recognize that they played a role in their life is this is where time limits came in. This is why time limits were in the Federal Welfare Reform Act. When you think about time, it's a social stabilizer. When you think about time, it makes you sit up straight and think about your life. And we needed them to re-engage in their life, because for 50 years, the left has told people that they didn't have to think about their life. They didn't have to think about natural consequences that come from out-of-control decisions and reckless living. You know, when you think about right now, the top 3 social crises confronting us as a nation, they're rooted in sexual matters: AIDS, abortion, and the welfare state. And we had the sexual revolution where we taught women that you don't have to think about that. We have now safety nets. So we wanted people to get back engaged in their lives. So time limits were a very important component of welfare reform. 2 years and then 5 years over your life. We all can, in our own lives, think about how time is a social stabilizer. If you're a young person, many of you are interns, and we really appreciate when our interns come to Washington, D.C. Free labor. I mean, not exactly free labor, but opportunities to train. We can get a little bit of work done that really needs to get done. We just finished with our first intern over at Cure, and we are so thankful, because you start accumulating a whole lot of stuff and leave out a whole lot of detail that somebody needs to collect for you, while everybody else is pretending they're overworked. So interns come in handy. But when you think about interns, they're coming out of colleges. And when you went into college at freshman, your attitude wasn't the same as when you're looking at being a senior and thinking you have to mainstream. The same way when you're a freshman in high school. I mean, you're ready to party. You're not thinking about the same thing that someone that's a senior is thinking about in terms of where they're going to go to college and how they're going to move into adulthood. So time is a social stabilizer. And it really helped the women, those 5 million women and their 9 million children who were living off that political promise of government, that they didn't have to worry about anything that they were doing. As they were watching their kids not have a good education, as they were watching as they moved into their teenage years, being carted off to prison, where we were, trying to control crime. So they were looking at 3 strikes types of laws, and then could perhaps end up the rest of their life in jail. This is unacceptable in a free country like ours, so where we really believe that people have worth and value, where we look at our Declaration of Independence and say we're all created equal. So what we wanted to do with time limits in the welfare reform was to just get folks engaged again. But another important component to welfare reform was work, because you're not going to get out of poverty if you don't work. Oh, my goodness, as I tell many welfare women all across this country, because I do still engage at that level, the key to work is not a minimum wage or a promise of government. The key to work is just get in, take any job, and then work harder than the person above you. So we need barriers removed, and still do, over work opportunities when it comes to the aggression of the left have put in all these new environmental policies, excessive taxation, the regulations that are really hurting work from being developed, especially in our hard-hit communities. I mean, you think it's bad out there in the heartland of America, the policies of the administration that's sitting here. It's been cruel in these urban communities and rural neighborhoods for an awful long time because it was their social experiment. And so they put these policies in place a long time ago, extra taxes on top of taxes in our cities to where most people can't live there, and except the very wealthy and or the very poor. And it's a really interesting dynamic. So we need those types of policies removed, but we also need work requirements in welfare reform. If you don't work, you won't eat. It is almost impossible, including those that are dependent upon food stamps. It really isn't enough to sustain yourself and a family if you're needed now to use some of your food stamps or your food stamp purchase ability to try to get other things done in your life, buying your children enough stuff to go to school with on the first day. So what we need is for them to engage their lives, to begin the process of work so that they can develop a skill set, so that then they can go on into life and perhaps get a little bit more schooling, which would be the third step out of poverty. Then they get to the point where they can save and invest in their future, and then you get to the point where you're actually giving back, which is where you really start prospering. And so what has happened of late? The reason that we're here is to discuss the changes that are occurring now over at HHS, the Health and Human Services Department, under the leadership of Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, which you've heard her name recently as she attacked the Catholic Church and demanded that they start providing contraceptives and other ills that are against their very traditions and beliefs, and they're in lawsuit about that. But now we're on the war again to say, why would you undo what was so successful in helping women recover their lives by adhering to the new rules of welfare? What happened during that time is we changed it from what was it, AFDC, they called it Aid to Families with Dependent Children, to TANF, Temporary Assistance for needy families. Why? Because we wanted them to see it as temporary. Most women didn't want to live like that, and nor do they today. I was with Claire Booth Luce last week. They gave me a wonderful honor and asked me to say a few words, and C-SPAN was there, and I didn't know I was to say a few words, and nor that C-SPAN was there, and so I just started talking from my heart, and I got a most interesting letter from a woman who said, I have been struggling in and out of welfare. I'm between jobs right now, and I heard your story. I heard what you said that day, and it has empowered me. That's what our welfare reform bill did. It empowered women to say, you know, I can do this. You know, they're not booting me off, as when I did the Oprah Winfrey show, she told her 7 million viewers out there that we were going to have their children starving and them living in the street. No, that's not what happened. What happened was they put their shoulders up, and many in the private sector, including organizations that weren't even in existence then, called Dress for Success, started coming up to say, wait, if they're going to reform, let's help them. Let's get them some wear so that they can go into these job interviews. We started seeing movement in the grassroots where decent people in quiet communities were saying, let's make sure that they're literate. Let's pour into some of these new training programs and make sure that when they go in, they know how to fill out an application. There was an engagement that occurred after '96 in welfare reform. We started seeing roles drop overnight. Now, we're finding a lot of fraud. In fact, I was with some of my friends up in Pennsylvania, and they're like, whoa, some of the things that states where they had Democrat control, you have to go in and see what they qualified as work. Some of those things you've been seeing lately on the news, I mean, massagists don't necessarily qualify as work, you know, or laying around on your bed because you turned the other way. That's not real work. Okay, so, you know, so we are finding that the numbers might not been quite at 50%, but we do know one thing. We started seeing more engagement, and we started seeing this community of people recover themselves. You know, it hit hardest the black community because the black community was most vulnerable when they started the social engineering in the 60s. And so you know, now we can look at this community and see a case study. You know, what goes on there when we make these types of reforms. And one of the things that went on that was undercovered for sure in the media was that 10 years after welfare reform, now we're fast forward into 2006, what we saw was that girls between the ages of 14 and 16, I believe it was, had lower pregnancies, lower abortion rates, and higher educational aspirations. And of course, then the left, those that want to promote condoms every opportunity, and abortion, said that's because of condoms, and we were teaching sex ed in the schools that we saw this drop. And then those that were teaching abstinence to science said, no, that's because of abstinence that we saw these types of drops. But if you start to look a little bit lower, you think, wait a minute, these girls were 5 and 6 years old when we passed welfare reform, and when they saw their mama get up and go to work every day, and they started seeing the difference it makes in saying, I've got to stabilize myself, not just the joy that she has that I have a job, because we were getting record numbers of stories like that too, that women that for the first time in their lives worked and how good they felt about themselves, even though it was very hard work. But they also saw that I can't just play my life away anymore. There are rules now, there are time limits, there are work requirements. Perhaps I need to take seriously those things that are in front of me in terms of social norms and reforms. And they might not have been thinking about that, in their head and reasoning through it, maybe not even their heart, because I have a 6-year-old grandson. I could tell you they don't think like that. Maybe the girls do a little bit more than the guys, but we certainly started seeing it in behavior, because as they went through those first few years of school, their behaviors had changed significantly from those behaviors that we were seeing in these same communities prior to welfare reform. So it was a good thing that happened in our society. And so we need to talk about the changes that are being proposed and what will happen if they go through. Well, what went wrong? What went wrong with welfare reform? Well, one of the first things that went wrong, in my opinion, and why I think that we're having this discussion again, and why the left through this administration thinks that they can get away with just saying, don't worry about time work requirements anymore, different states just do whatever we want to. I think because we thought perhaps that policy changes alone would fix the problem. But the challenge is government dependency. Government dependency was replaced by personal responsibility 2 generations ago. And this is a challenge for us. As I mentioned already, in the 60s, we had a culture of entitlement, which was a war on poverty. We had a culture of meaninglessness, which was the war on women through their sexual revolution. We had a culture of corruption, this war on religion, weakened the institutions. Therefore, we started seeing corruption even in our state government, even people that are supposed to be the law. We started seeing corruption at those levels, those that are cooking the books about what the real numbers look like, even in something as simple as welfare reform. Those that were working on behalf of us, serving us, at least they're supposed to be, as government bureaucrats who crossed their arms and decided they weren't going to implement the very rules that were sitting in front of them. So it allowed for this notion of entitlement, government dependency, meaninglessness to continue in our society, even though we had welfare reform. You've got to have engagement of the people and belief from the people to get something, a public policy implemented at the very core or at the very heart of America, down in the communities that it matters to most. And so as a society, we're falling apart, and we're asking yet those that are weakest and most vulnerable be responsible. It didn't happen. So we began to see government take hold in places that we didn't normally see it. Today, 70% of all non-defense tax intake is a transfer to individuals. Today, 47% of Americans are in some way government dependent. When we were in welfare reform, we saw this cancer in these communities, our case study communities, our hard-hit, most vulnerable communities, and welfare reform is to stop that cancer. We wanted to stop the hemorrhaging so that it didn't spill out in the mainstream, so that they had a fighting chance for the beauty and success of America. And instead, what we saw is we were going in a different direction. It started spilling out to where now it's through the whole of our society, where we have now today 40% of all Americans. 40% of all births in this country today are paid for by Medicaid. Now, for those that are not familiar with Medicaid, it's a welfare program. They don't count it in the welfare programs when they try to tell us, well, defense has double budget that welfare does. as events is about 24% of the budget, and welfare, what they consider welfare, is about 12%. You start throwing in Medicaid, you've got a whole lot more of our budget that's in these poverty programs than you might hear on the evening news if you listen to the traditional news, which I know most people in here don't. But the Medicaid program is an absolute poverty program, womb to tomb. It doesn't matter if there's just a little boo-boo on their knee, they can take them into the emergency room and get full care. This is an area that needs to be reformed for sure. But it also, Medicaid pays today the bills of 60% of all long-term nursing home care. So we have big challenges when it comes to welfare policies and how we're going to peel back so that we can begin to reduce the size and scope of government. That's why the last thing we need is for this administration to change the rules that were put into place in the 90s and send us back into what type of chaos we had prior to that. Time doesn't allow me to tell you what type of chaos we had during that time. And I think if we dust off some of the documents from Heritage from 15, 20 years ago, or it's probably on their website, you will see the picture of the destruction that welfare policies up until 96 did to particular individuals as well as communities, to be in horror, to say we should not go back to that point. I think that I might be running out of time here. You never told me how long do I have, but I wanted to say that the entitlement budgets are out of control, as you already know. The glaring truth underlying our economic collapse and our welfare crises is that liberalism doesn't work. Didn't work for blacks, and it doesn't work for the middle class. You know, in just 50 years, blacks went from 70% of their children raised in married households to 70% now being raised in single households. When Reagan was president, 18% of births were out of marriage. Today, out of marriage births are 40%. And in fact, there were 1.7 million in 2011 alone. Blacks are now at 72% out of wedlock births. Latinos are at 53%, and whites during the 60s, they were at 3%. Today, it's just under 30%. We can't keep going like this if we're going to be a whole and healthy nation, because what we see in our inner cities is reflective of what we're going to see in the rest of America if we keep down this same journey that we've already seen communities in our inner cities go down. And welfare policy is the reason that they went down those journeys. In the 60s, 75% of American adults were married, compared to around 50% today. We are absolutely coming apart, as Charles Murray, a libertarian thinker, said in his most recent book. You know, as Heritage Foundation has pointed out, today the federal government operates nearly 80 welfare programs at a total cost to state and local governments that is approaching $1 trillion annually. This is unfathomable. How in the world will we survive as a country? Think about our federal intake right now. It's about 2.5 trillion for, if you want to start thinking in those numbers. And yet they're spending, about 3.8 trillion. And this is just the welfare portion. I mean, the demand on the states and the local communities, it is a wonder that they're now going broke themselves. They're having to file bankruptcies, trying to keep up with the pensions and the promises that they've made to their underclass. What we've got to do is come up with some new plans. Where do we go from here? We know the challenge in front of us. We tried to correct it. This administration is trying to undo those changes. We need to make sure that we stop them. But there are things that we can do to help people recover. One of the things that we should do, in my opinion, is to develop out a comprehensive reform plan. It's one thing to talk about just the dollars and cents of what's on the old program, and then to put in time limits and make requirements of the women and some men that are on the system. Many times, more often than not, scamming the system or trying to find ways around the rules of welfare because they are not helpful for somebody to advance in this society today. But I think that because of the cultural breakdown, we should look at it much more comprehensively, and there are about 5 areas that I think should be involved in that comprehensive look. And what I'm working on an idea with some of my friends that are in welfare agencies is a concept to model after this idea called charter cities. That's for international or other countries. It's an economist, Romer, developed this concept for other countries, but I'm thinking, why can't we do something similar here? Why is it that, we're just we can look at our economic enterprise zones and perhaps try to attract businesses there, or try to con them to come there, because it's very difficult for them to get there, and then think that they're going to be fruitful with all of the aggressiveness of government against them. But why can't we look at our urban communities and perhaps build out charter zones? You know, we have charter schools that have been very, very successful, and when one particular friend brought this idea of charter zone, because I didn't have a name for it, he's like, it sounds like what you're describing is a charter zone. I'm like, that's a really good name for trying to look at 5 areas that each and every one of those that are in our welfare system are confronted with, and laws are surrounding them, and the bureaucracies are surrounding them, and many are just now finding out that food stamps is in the agricultural thing. Well, wait a minute, what is it doing over there? I thought it was over the welfare office. No, the welfare office is on Independence Avenue. Go figure, mockery, irony. Yeah, why aren't they all in one office? No, everywhere that you saw that faith-based initiative go, that's where we have welfare money. That's why it went over there. There's a little bit of labor, a little bit in education, a little bit in housing, a little bit. Why not do something comprehensive? Look at job creation, and maybe in these zones, just let them be tax and regulation free. Now, is that all taxes? Maybe, depending on the type of tax, but we certainly don't need minimum wage laws in our hardest hit communities where we're looking at 40% unemployment rate with our youth. I mean, just do the youth, exempt them from things like minimum wage laws. Perhaps exempt those that are over 75 from some of their property taxes. Why is it that someone can do everything right all their life, and then they're still hit hard by government? And in many of these states, government is very aggressive. State governments are very aggressive against them when it comes to property tax, because they're trying to pay for all this welfare state. And so it rests on the backs of those that have worked off, paid off their homes, and now they can barely pay their property tax bill because it's out of control. So in job creation, in housing, oh my goodness, I think that's one of the things that should have been dealt with during welfare reform, because what the liberals have so cleverly done in their welfare policies is trapped people in certain communities. And so we've just kind of isolated the problem, put it over there, and made these basically cesspools where we have sexual prowling going on, where men can come in our housing projects because there's no healthy households there, and just go from household to household and make sure that he left behind either the HIV virus and or a baby. And now HIV AIDS is the #1 killer of African American women between 25 and 34 in these housing projects, where 20, 30 years ago we were trying to contain it by quarantining at least a little while so we could find out what was going on. And it became then a civil right of its own, and now it's killing black women, a far different place than when it was first discovered to be killing homosexual white men. But housing is an important component, because if you unleash residents and allow them to go anywhere they want to live, even if it's a home of a woman whose husband of 60 years just passed away and she's thinking now downsizing, but she perhaps knowing that there's an opportunity availed to her to do what the scripture says, where the elder teaches the younger, would let that girl and her child come in so that she can do what Titus says, teach them how to live, how to love their children, how to love their husbands. How in the world would we figure out these things if not for the scripture? And if it were so natural, then why did the scripture tell us we have to be taught to do these things? And it does say love your children. And as a wonder, we see all these children that they're being abandoned by their mother, and we keep telling ourselves that it's just a natural instinct. It is not a natural instinct. These are learned behaviors over time because of culture and tradition, and you let down that guard, which we've seen it let down in our society, you begin to have people doing the most vile even to their own. So housing is an area that should be in that comprehensive plan to say, no, in addition to building out an area that we're just going to pilot, where we have job creation, meaning remove the barriers, housing where they can just go anywhere to live with their Section 8 voucher, health care, allowing them to go anywhere with their Medicaid card, not to concentrate in certain areas. I was working in one area with them trying to make some reforms to where the nearest OBGYN was 60 miles away. This is what happens when government controls health care. When Michael Moore brought out his movie Sicko, I had one opportunity to go on that horrible show called The View to only ask him one question, but I needed to sit between Joy Behar and Barbara Walters for 45 minutes to get to him to ask him the one question. It was torture. And I think I'm going to ask God for a goodie point if he will give it to me when I get to heaven, just for doing that. But I just want to ask him one thing. I'm like, why did you go to Canada and Cuba to see socialized medicine? You could have gone to Compton or Camden. You can go to any inner city in this country and see what happens when government controls healthcare, because it's controlled it for 50 years in every one of our hard-hit communities. And those communities are left wanting. There's no way that I could sit here and tell you the damage that is being done in terms of health care when it comes to these communities, because time just doesn't allow. I was looking at that Pure Michigan ad that says 85 summers. I'm thinking 85 summers. I'm 55 years old. I only have 30 summers. I'm not going to spend the rest of this summer telling you the damage of Medicaid. You can just look yourself and see what we're discussing in terms of obesity, child mortality rates, you name the long list, and know that this is a direct result of government involved in health care. So why couldn't we have it where they just get a voucher and go buy themselves an insurance plan? I bet they'll then have to adhere to rules of insurance the same way when you go out to Geico and get your insurance, it's a little bit higher, but they tell you, you better keep your driving record clean. Most amazing thing, when people are told what they need to do to restore themselves to health, that they adapt the habits to do it. You go out into that world where the interest rates are very high on your second chance to get a credit card, and people are willing to do it because they know they need that credit card. Over time, their interest rate falls because they know I'm paying that on time. The same way those that buy their cell phone in advance, and many of the other services that are for the communities that need that second chance. We should be able to adopt some of those ideas in things like healthcare. In education, the successes are broad in education now that finally the idea of vouchers has caught on, especially in our hard-hit communities, to where now we have Democrat legislators fighting for vouchers. I remember when we first started this stuff, we were beat up, run out of places when it came to just discussing money should follow children to the schools their parents want. And now the message has gotten in. That's all y'all were saying? Money should follow children to the school we want? We want it. And we're seeing successes all over this country, not just with vouchers, but with charter schools and educational options and choices, and what they're doing in Louisiana now. The people in Florida are getting jealous, saying, we're going to change the ban law. We're going to change our constitution so that people can have freedom when it comes to educating their children. Well, we need more samples. When the Supreme Court ruled in 2003 or so that it's not unconstitutional for money to follow children, even to religious schools, we should rejoice on that and get that done for those that are in our hardest hit communities. And so I would like to see a comprehensive plan that includes that. And then finally, one of crime, and talking about second chance. This is one place that second chance legislation has sputtered out every time it's brought up here on Capitol Hill, because it just doesn't get buy-in from people that don't understand why it's so critical that if somebody has a little blotch on their record, that they need an opportunity to mainstream if they get out of that prison situation. It's very difficult to have a scarlet letter when you're 14 years old because you just got caught up in the lie. You bought the lie. Think about my own life. And when Michelle talked about my book, Pimps, Whores, and Welfare Brats, that is my autobiography. I named it that because of my life. And had I not gotten a second chance of being born again, I put a lot in there because I'm not sure about statutes of limitations, and I didn't want to end up in jail, but to be able to get that second chance in Christ was very important to me. And so when you think about others that are doing some of the same things I was doing, and now they perhaps might need society to say, I need a second chance, we should be able to maybe in this comprehensive plan at least test it. Because, the scales of justice have two sides. There's judgment, but there's mercy. And what we've lacked now is a combination of the both. What we've seen is when the uproars of all this criminal activity because of all these single households and all the rest of the pathologies that come from government dependency and no moral framework, we want to get hard. And on the other side, you have people that they don't understand, liberals, what mercy really means. They just want it lawlessness. Don't do anything. Don't ever judge anybody for any type of activities. And so we haven't seen the combination of the both. So in conclusion, I suppose my answer would be the same thing that Ronald Reagan's answer was, that answer to poverty is faith, it's freedom, it's personal responsibility. It's not a welfare state. The answer to poverty is prosperity. And in order to get prosperity for those that need it the most, we are going to have to ensure that the laws that we passed in the 90s stay the way they are so that we can keep pushing down, and then that the new laws that come are consistent with our founding principles of freedom and personal responsibility. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much, Star. What a wonderful talk. Just rich in details and information to remind us about those battles we fought and that we're going to have to fight again, I guess. We have a couple mics here. Oh, these are two of our Claire Booth Luce interns. Ashley is from California, Azusa
we met the other day.
Pacific, and Laurel goes to Cornell. And by the way, we do pay ours. Not a lot,
I
but
know,
we.
I was just teasing. I think most do, actually, yeah.
And if you would give your name and affiliation, raise your hand and Star will call on you.
I was just teasing about that interns unpaid, because that's another one that left when people are trying to encourage, internship. Oh, that they're just trying to get cheap, free
Yeah,
labor. It's like,
right.
actually, it's a great opportunity, and we do pay them, but they're always fighting them. Anyway, I have a question over here. Thank you.
Yes.
Wait for the mic, please, so that it'll go on the tape there, yeah. Thank you. Your name?
My name is Charlie Kuhn, and unfortunately, I've been unemployed for 2 years, but I've been blessed with a 2-day-a-week part-time job, so that's going to help. Doesn't pay anything, but it's going to help for the resume. My question to you is, the president doesn't have the constitutional authority to just go into a statute and change the statute. That changing a statute is a legislative responsibility, I believe.
Yeah.
And I don't hear too much criticism about him doing that. And I'm just curious as to why not.
I think most of the reason you don't hear much is because the Attorney General's office is on his side. I think that there is a frustration that this administration has gotten away with and is attempting to get away with many things that are unconstitutional. In fact, I think it was Congressman Clyburn, what's his name from South Carolina? Clyburn, I believe, that said when he was confronted with the question of constitutionality of some of the things that were taking place, including Obamacare, he just told everyone that not much we do up here is constitutional. So I think we're going to have to resolve ourselves, that those of us that take seriously the future that our children and grandchildren will live in this country, make sure that even the next time Republicans are in control, that they look at the constitutionality of every single thing and every single decision that they're making here. You know, we've laxed ourselves, and, you know, even under Republican administration, we've laxed ourselves. And I think many now are understanding that it's critical. We can't go on like this. We can't have a nation of half makers and half takers. We can't have a nation where we're aborting 4,000 to 5,000 children a day and think, well, nobody matters. It doesn't matter. Nobody cares. We can't have a nation where a definition of marriage that should be sacred is not protected from the onslaught of special interests. We're just a people that now, in our lifetime, at this moment in our lifetime, have to make a decision who we're going to be as a nation. Are we going to be biblical and free, or are we going to be secular and socialist? And that's what's at stake. And it's a cultural war that has been raging for a long time, and many have been actively involved in it. But I think that the heartland of America, who actually are much like the fish that didn't know there was water until he's starting to see the beach. He's grasping his way back into the water, and I'm very thankful for the Tea Party purging the Republican Party. And in fact, in my column today, looking at what's happening with this mandate for marriage that many African American pastors are calling for, I'm looking at that, and I said I would hope that those Democrats, those evangelical Christian conservative Democrats, will do to their party what the Tea Party is doing to Republicans. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Kate Miller.
Hi,
The
Kate.
Heritage Foundation.
Oh, good.
For the record, we are also paid. My question is, if the policies don't change in terms of entitlements, then what can we do on an interpersonal level to help bring people out of the welfare system?
The best thing that you can do to help people out of the welfare system, short of policy changes, is get them born again. You need to make sure that they understand that their life is not their own and that they are re-engaged in their life. Because short of having a eternal worldview or perspective, I'm surprised more people aren't just kind of living off the dole. Who would work hard in this society? And when I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing unemployment numbers up. I mean, there was a time that many people of America wouldn't even go on unemployment. They felt it was a shame. There were many a time, there was a point in our history that no, they would not go on food stamps. They felt, there were a time in black communities, they wouldn't do these things. During the 60s, when they started this social engineering and the means test started getting more difficult, the black community started unraveling, but this was a shame to go on welfare. And you would start looking at the rules come down from Washington that said, well, if we're going to be arbitrarily giving away other people's money, we better have some type of means test. And the means tests were, well, no able working body in the home. So there were even movies, if you recall, that were showing where the woman would have to hide her husband's clothing and make sure that when the caseworker came to make sure no able body lived there, that the husband's existence wasn't there. And so over time, marriage stopped occurring. So you have to really think about on a deep personal level why we believe what we believe. And not that everybody is a born-again Christian. It is a social stabilizer in a way that people begin to re-engage their life. And so we shouldn't discount the essence of religion and how valuable it is. And in particular, when you look at the scripture, when Jesus was confronted by John the Baptist's disciples at one point when John was in jail, and he had asked the Lord he asked his disciples to go ask the Lord, are you the one or should we look for another? Jesus sent him back some things that that they had seen occurring. He said, go tell him these things are occurring for him to make a decision for himself. And the things he listed, he said, well, the blind are seen, the dead are raised, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf are hearing, and the gospel's being preached to the poor. Now that seems out of place if you think about the great miracle in these other occurrences, unless that in itself, that the gospel's being preached to the poor in itself is a miracle. So the most successful places that we see in the private sector working with those that are most hardest hit and poor are religious institutions that are in their communities. So, and it is extremely valuable when they talk to them about having a personal relationship with the Lord. Once that's done, there's some accountability to say, okay, is it God or government? And that would be what I would suggest. That said, though, it's still hard, and that's why we have to change public policy, because public policy, it actually influences public behavior, and public behavior then influences public opinion then policy, and so we're going in this circle, and the worst the behaviors are, the public opinion starts to shift, and we're starting to see that in data as well, on some things that there was a point in America we would never think needed to be discussed in the public square that we're talking about today. Not only are those numbers changing, they're changing very rapidly because of the public schools indoctrinating our youth in a secular humanistic worldview. So while I want people to really engage on a local level, I was one that wanted charity tax credits and welfare reform to where people can just pour money into the private organizations that are doing the most amazing work in our local communities. But one-on-one evangelism is how you really reach a heart. Yes.
Ashley Shelton, also an intern at Heritage, and I go to Harding, so I'm excited you're coming.
Oh, I am.
Fall.
Do you know Angelisa Schrader by chance? I was going to call her Anderson. I've known her since she was
Of course
Anderson.
I do.
I know, I'm just playing with you.
Obviously, the federal government has way too much involvement in welfare, and the administering, and it should develop down to the states more. But how should the states go about regulating or making sure there isn't fraud? And I mean, we don't want a big hand in government, but we have to have some kind of accountability.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that look like?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because there are two schools of thought, and I actually think and hope that after the elections, and we here in Washington start talking again about policy changes, that we have a discussion whether this federal-state relationship should be occurring. I mean, think about what's happening right now. The taxpayers send their money to the federal government. the federal government then decides in welfare policy, we're going to spend on these things. And we're going to tell the states what to do, and we're going to take a little bit off the top to pay for all of our bureaucracy, and then we're going to send down to the states. Then the state is going to say, we got to figure out what to do here too, so we need to build a bureaucracy, and then we're going to send a little bit down to the county. Then the county says, boy, I tell you, we need to do something about this too, so we need to build out of bureaucracy. So we're going to send on down to the city. By the time it gets to the households, less than 20 cents on a dollar is actually helping the people we say we want to help. So I think that we need to have discussion of this is a good idea. Now, some would argue that we don't want the federal government doing this work, so it should be only the state. So let's block grant, and that was the concept in welfare reform. Some are now starting to say maybe the states are the middleman, and we should remove that so that we can really get down to business, get the kind of reforms we want, and get rid of that middleman. Maybe some or others are saying there should be no federal engagement. Absolutely, let's let the states have their own monies and let them work through those monies. The challenge with that idea, though, is where do you what dollar amount do you decide doesn't any longer come to the federal? And are we asking now for every state to have an income tax, which you're not going to get, nor should, in fact, I'm looking for a state that doesn't have one now that I think I'm going to move into. Wyoming's looking really good for me. So those are discussions we ought to have, the same way on tax policy. And we're finally getting to the point that enough Americans are moving center right enough to say we perhaps should have these harder discussions. They want to. The Tea Party and the Tea Party candidates that are coming to Washington are saying we are going to reduce the size of government. We're not going to do it overnight. We can't get it done overnight, but we're sure on at least on that path. And so we'll have that discussion. We'll probably start seeing discussions on tax reform again, where we're talking not just about should we, but about how, flat, consumption, different discussions like that. I think that we should have that in this arena as well, because I'm not 100% convinced that the federal government should be doing this work. And there are places that I think that part of the fraud, and a major part of the fraud and corruption, is of this state-federal relationship. Any other?
I have a question. Sir, one of the things that you did, which I think you were so uniquely positioned and really effective at doing things during the welfare reform debates, was really helping to educate the pastors on the impact of welfare on their communities, just like you were outlining in your speech. And they all saw it. They saw it in their pews on a regular basis. And I think you really helped. You brought a lot of them to Washington. I know Robert Rector here at Heritage spoke on a lot of your programs. Do you get the sense that the pastors you work with and the ones that you were so effective in reaching in '96 during the welfare reform debate have even heard that these work requirements that they really embraced have been waived, that the administration has taken this action, which even the Heritage Legal analysts have said is really illegal? It's expressly prohibited in the statute, as one of the questioners mentioned. Do you think that the pastors even know this has been done? And what do you think would be their reaction, if they were to kind of learn a bit more about this?
I'm going to answer the second part first, because I think that it's, I'm going to say no, I don't think that they know. And one of the reasons that they don't know is because of news source. Thank God that he created the internet. I'm glad it wasn't Al Gore, because if it was, they'd tax it by now. But they're not taxing it, so it must have been the Lord. And we can get information out. But one of the things that we're finding in all data is that blacks are not getting their information from the same sources that we get them from when it comes to news. So they're getting their news from the traditional sources that are controlled by the left. It's one of the reasons I still work very aggressively in these communities with pastors. And next month, we're bringing another delegation of pastors to Washington so that we can expose them to some of these things, because they just don't know. But the second part of your question, what would they do if they found out? That one's a little bit more difficult, not just because it's in the Barack Obama administration and many buy into this idea that they shouldn't uncover fellow African American, but also because the unemployment rates are already so high. I would believe that they would have a sense that, okay, if we put work requirements and yet work is, not available as it was during the 90s, it would be a dilemma for their communities. They're already dealing with very long food lines, and I'm looking forward to taking a camera into some of what is the biggest problem of this administration's strategies over the last 4 years, because our communities, you hear about a little bit in Chicago where it's erupted to the front page in crime, but these communities are just having a real difficult time. So I'm not sure that they would jump on this particular issue at this particular moment and say that, we object to you taking away time, the work requirements this close to an election, because all of that could change. So if in 5 months we really think that women that are encouraged and have an understanding that they should work would just stop working just because, the left says, hey, come on, why would you want to do something crazy like that when you can just let your life fall apart again? I think the cat is out of the bag. They are enjoying the fact that they have this independence and freedom. It's tough, but they're rewarded. And I think that the answer, even with our pastors, what we'll be discussing with them when they come to Washington, are not only in how we're reforming housing policy so that they can get more mobile. That's one of the challenges with, our at-risk communities. We've stuck them in particular communities, mostly based on the benefits that they get. And so if they were able to get mobile, then they could go where work is occurring. Every state's not busted. Where we have good Republican in charge of different states and the economies are starting to flourish in those states, you're seeing activity, you're seeing movement and mobility. It's only our hard hit that can't get to it. The same way in education, we could see there's some fruit. Everybody's not dying in education, and so we want to free them up to be able to be a little bit more mobile. But I don't think you're going to see an outcry, especially not of the level that you're seeing in the homosexual marriage. And I think more will grab onto that before they'll grab onto the changes in welfare policy. Yes.
Hi, Star.
Hi.
Like Michelle said, I'm the intern at Legal Policy Institute.
Yes.
I was wondering what your thoughts and comments are on Obama's recent statement that you didn't build that wasn't you, and how you feel about that.
Well, I was crying because I was wondering who did if I didn't build it. I'm like, why was I up all night the other night trying to figure out payroll? The president has been very clear in his disdain for entrepreneurs, freedom, free markets, capitalism. We do build. And what has made this country great, even if you look at even the Chick-fil-A story, which is why I think a lot more people are rallying that, even if they have no religious expression themselves and could care less about, homosexual marriage, according to the polling on this issue these days, they just like that good old-fashioned American story, that somebody took nothing and made something. They like knowing that your fate is not your destiny, and that's what the American dream is about. That's what Americanism is about. It's about, in creating an environment to where someone can be born in these set of circumstances, but they don't have to die there. And I think that it's backfiring on him, as we know. But it's not a story that we have to keep repeating because most Americans know that story. They know it in their own lives. I think that the business community was absolutely offended by him declaring that the work that they put behind. And the postponement of gratification, you don't hear much about that, and not many have written about, what it takes to build a business these days. The postponement of gratification is a big part of it. The family knows, everyone suffers, and you hope one day you make it. And you particularly look at black business. The black business community is in dire straits. These things are hitting them hard. It's underappreciated that 80% of black businesses gross less than $100,000 a year. These are mom and pop poor people just trying to make it, and every day they're dumped on, including with Obamacare. This is going to send most of them out of business because they just cannot afford those types of fines. It's enough that they're trying to pay the payroll tax. They call it a self-employment tax when you're on your own and you're an entrepreneur. And if you don't pay your payroll tax, which is supposed to be your Social Security, you're penalized. It's unbelievable what the government has done, what it gets away with through the instrument of the IRS, and who it hits the hardest. And even in this particular, you didn't build that, and the offense of it, you would think that the National Black Chamber of Commerce would be knocking at his door, and they may be. A lot of the things that are between black on black are happening a little bit more privately. But I think that he's going to feel it, not just, when they knock privately and say, we really didn't like what you just did there. I think he's going to feel it in November.
And when he talks about taxing the rich, He's talking about those small businesses that file as
Absolutely.
individuals.
Absolutely.
And he's going to put them out of business.
He's going to put them out of business.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting on this one, the businesses that he keeps talking about are $250,000 a year. These black businesses aren't grossing that,
Yeah.
but yet that extra taxes that he keeps insisting we have to have, that payroll tax, this Obamacare tax,
Right.
they're going to put them all out of business so that everybody will be dependent on government. And this particular community is already too dependent on government, 19%. Government is the number one employer of black men and the second largest of black women. There should be a national outcry for what government has already done the damage to this one particular community alone. Thank
Well,
you.
Star, you're the best. We want to give you a couple little gifts to
Oh,
thank
more
you.
gifts?